Okay, so we're going to continue on with our study of the habitat. The next stage, and this is the last step or stage within the study of a habitat. So this is what's known as step 9. And step 9 relates to this idea of what's known as interdependence. So interdependence. So this idea of interdependence. And if we look at a definition, so what is interdependence? So interdependence is the way one thing relies on another. So this is this idea of interdependence. So for example, like a real example of this. So if we take humans, for example, so we have a human here. This is a human. Okay, this is our little stick human. In order to survive, I'm going to give him some eyes. So in order to survive, we need O2. So in order for us to survive, we need to inhale O2. And also as well, we need glucose. So we need food, for example, we need to consume food. So where does this food come from? So we need oxygen and we need glucose, for example, for us to survive, in order for us to get energy, in order for us to keep our bodies functioning. But where do we get this from? So if we take plants then, for example, so here's our plant. So we have a plant here, imagine it's the ground, and it has a root structure. So what does the plant do? So the plant has to take in CO2. So it takes in CO2 from the air, takes in H2O from the water, from the ground, through its roots. And what does it give out? Well, it gives out CO2, it gives out oxygen, so it produces the oxygen that we breathe. And also then as well, it produces this glucose as well. So it makes the glucose that we eat. So within inside the plant, what happens is it makes glucose. So where does it get its CO2 and water from? Well, what happens is this CO2, we take in these guys, but we then give out CO2. And we also produce water vapor as well. We make water vapor as well. So this CO2 that we produce can be consumed by the plant, and the oxygen then that it produces, we can consume it. So what happens is we rely on plants and plants rely on us. So this is this idea of interdependence. So it's the way that one thing relies on another. And in ecology, like we rely on many different things. So for example, like living organisms will depend on non-living things. So those abiotic factors. So things like air, light, warmth, water, materials, and food. So we need these things to rely on. But in ecology, when we're talking about interdependence, really what we're looking at is the way like organisms rely on each other. And we can look at this in different ways. So we can look at things like food chains. So these things that are called food chains. And basically food chains, what they do is they tell us about the relationship so food chains show the way energy is passed from one organism to another. So they basically show how energy is passed from one organism to another. So when we talk about food chains, we can talk about something like this, for example. So this is like a very common. So if we take, for example, the nettle. So the nettle, so we know about nettles, we talked a little bit about them. So nettles are eaten by caterpillars. So the nettle is eaten by the caterpillar, and then the caterpillar is eaten by the blackbird. So what's happening here is, so this is an example of a what's known as a food chain. So it's a very, very simple food chain. So we can see that caterpillars, so imagine this is our nettle. This is our nettle plant. Okay, and then our caterpillar. So imagine this is our caterpillar. It can look something like this. And then we have our blackbird. So it looks something like this. Okay, and I know that's a brutal looking blackbird. So what happens is all of these guys, they interrelate to each other. So the nettle, okay, it's actually taking energy from the sun. Imagine this is the energy from the sun. And through the process of photosynthesis, so again, remember, it's going to have the sun, and you're going to have the energy from the sun. Through the process of photosynthesis, it traps, for example, glucose within the leaves and within the plant. Then what happens is this caterpillar comes along and it relies on this nettle for food, so it consumes this producer and it uses the energy to function itself. And then what happens is our blackbird then comes along and he eats the caterpillar. So what's happened is you get, for example, solar energy from the sun. It's being converted into chemical energy, being converted into a chemical glucose, and then that chemical energy then has been released by the caterpillar when it eats up the plant and uses the glucose within the plant. And then what happens is the bird then comes along and eats the caterpillar and it uses up the energy then as well. So food chains show the way energy is passed from one organism to another through food. So again, we can look at this like energy is being passed through this system here. We can also have what are known as food webs. And a food web shows a number of interconnecting food chains. So if we take this food chain, for example, we can have a much more complicated or more detailed what's known as a food web. We look at an example of what we mean by a food web. So if we have a look at this example here, so this is an example of a food web. So a food web shows a number of interconnecting food chains. So we can see here, so we can look at like a number of different interconnecting food chains. So we can see that we have seeds. Seeds are eaten by mice, and then mice are eaten by owls, for example. And what's happening is the energy is being passed through these organisms. The same here, so for example, we have primroses. Snails eat primroses, so the energy that's in this is being passed to the snail. The hedgehogs eat snails. Okay, so the energy is passed from there. And then owls also eat hedgehogs as well. So again, this is an example of a food web. The same here, so we have dead leaves, for example. Dead leaves are eaten by earthworms. Okay, the earthworms then are eaten by thrushes or starlings, are eaten by birds. And then sparrowhawks eat the starlings or the thrushes as well. So again, you have this passing of energy and materials between these organisms. So, and another way to think about it is all of these guys are, so if you look up here, within this food web, these are all interdependent on each other. So for example, so these are the primary producers, if you like. And then we have these consumers up here. So everything, if you like, relies on these producers to some extent or another. If you take out these producers, these guys up here don't have food. Okay, so their numbers will drop. If these numbers up here drop, then these guys will not have food, so their numbers will drop. And then if the numbers up here drop, then these guys up here will drop as well. So there's a deep or complicated interconnection or interdependence between all of these between all of these organisms within this particular habitat. This idea of interdependence. So interdependence is a very, very fine balancing act. So if producers at the beginning of the food chain in a habitat die off, then the rest of the organisms in the food chain are also in danger of dying off due to lack of food, like we've just mentioned. So again, even in this simple food chain here, so for example, if nettles die off, the caterpillars don't have food. If the caterpillars don't have food, they die off. And then the blackbirds don't have food, and if they don't have food, then they die off as well. So there's this interdependence, between these organisms. This feeding relationship shows very clearly the interdependence of organisms on each other. So you can clearly see that these are all interdependent on each other. They're all linked together. Animals very much depend on plants for their food. So for example, these animals here depend on plants for their food, and they do this either directly by feeding on the plants. So for example, the caterpillar feeds directly on the nettle, or by feeding on other animals that feed on plants. So for example, the blackbird doesn't eat the nettles directly, but it eats the caterpillars, which relies on nettles as well. So there's this relationship between these guys. But plants also depend on animals for pollination. So plants rely on animals to carry pollen from flower to flower to ensure the formation of fruit. So for example, like insects, or like plants use insects to carry their pollen around and pollinate other plants. So there's a relationship between the plants and the animals as well. Plants also rely on animals to spread seeds, their seeds to ensure germination of the next year's crop as well. So sometimes birds will also eat berries will eat berries. And then those berries, then they'll eat, the berries will go through the digestive system, and the seeds are contained within the berries. And then that bird will get rid of the waste out of its body, and in that waste there will be the seeds of the plant, and those seeds then will grow into the next generation of that plant. So overall, the control of the population of a particular group of organisms, so let's say the overall control of the population, is dependent on another population of organisms. So what do we mean by that? So if we want to think about the population of blackbirds, for example, that's very much linked in with the population of caterpillars. So if you reduce the population of caterpillars, you're going to reduce the population of blackbirds as well, because they're their food source. If you reduce the population of nettles, you're going to reduce the population of caterpillars, because they rely on nettles in order for them to survive. So there's this like deep interconnectedness, or what we call interdependence, and this is the way that one thing relies on another. So this is what we mean by these different stages of what's known as interdependence. And this is step 9. So really in step 9, what you're trying to do when you've studied your habitat, you want to kind of start looking at how are the organisms and the plants and the animals within your habitat, how are they all related to each other, or how are they all interlinked? So hopefully that makes sense, and that just introduces us to this idea of food chains. And we also looked at the food web as well. So food webs are just more, there are lots of food chains that then kind of connected together. So that's okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and thank you for listening.